Hi, I'm Virginia Postrel, the author of The Fabric of Civilization: How Textiles Made the World. This video is one of a series inspired by my book. I hope you'll check them all out and, of course, read the book. Enjoy. I'm back in West Hollywood visiting James Peterson's prickly pear cactus sculpture. Now that I've done my own cochineal dyeing, its color takes on new significance. What exactly do we mean when we say cochineal makes cloth red? To see what I'm getting at and find out how my experiments went, keep watching. At the end of my video on the history of cochineal, I promised to do some cochineal dyeing of my own. I'm ready to share those results, but first I have to tell you something about the process. It's not nearly as simple as just throwing some bugs in a pot of water and adding your textiles. The first thing you have to do is make sure the dye will stick to your fibers. That requires soaking them in what's called a mordant solution. A mordant is a chemical that makes dye adhere to fibers. The word mordant comes from the Latin word that means to bite. Mordants are essential for red dyes, and they've been used since prehistoric times. But even today, chemists don't fully understand how they work. The first mordant I tested was alum. Alum occurs naturally as a crystal in deserts and volcanic areas, which is probably why it was discovered very early. By classical antiquity, people had already figured out how to manufacture it from an even more common mineral called alunite. Alum production has been called the world's first chemical industry. By the Middle Ages, it was a huge international business. Writing in 1540, the Italian author Vannunzio Biringuccio called alum no less necessary to dyers of wool and woolen cloth than bread is to humankind. The second mordant I tested was a relative latecomer whose history is directly connected to cochineal. It's Stannous Chloride, a tin compound. In the early 1600s, Cornelius Drebbel, a Dutch inventor and alchemist living in London, discovered that you could get a bright, beautiful scarlet by treating fabric with a tin acid before dyeing it with cochineal. His daughters and sons-in-law used his discovery, which they kept as a family secret, to set up a thriving dye house. The cochineal dyed wool in this 18th century coat probably used Drebbel's process. Next, you have to turn the cochineal into a dye bath. Dried cochineal looks like crystals or grains, which is why Europeans sometimes called it grana. When it first came from Mexico, they had no idea whether it was animal, vegetable, or mineral. For my first round of dyeing, I used cultivated cochineal that I bought on Etsy. Some I ground myself in a coffee grinder, and the rest I bought in powdered form. Then I simmered it in a pot of water to dissolve the dye. I filtered the water cup by cup through cheesecloth to get out most of the particles. Finally, I was ready to add my textiles. See, the dye starts to take right away, and we're actually going to soak that overnight. Then I repeated the process, this time using wild cochineal. This is cochineal, which I have collected from the cactuses of the Beverly Hills Cactus Garden. It is wild cochineal. It is not cultivated for its dye uses. It is a pest that is killing those cactuses, or at least their leaves, and a lot of this is actually from leaves I collected and then brought home and scraped off. It's a little bit smelly. Not horrible, but definitely has a little bit of that, it's protein, decaying smell. We have a dark red powder. After dyeing, washing, and drying each batch, it was time for the reveal. Let's start with wool. I dyed 3 pairs of 100% wool socks. 2 I dyed with cultivated cochineal, mordanted with Stannous Chloride, mordanted with alum. The other I dyed with wild cochineal, mordanted with Stannous Chloride. Wool loves cochineal, and you can see why Europeans, for whom wool was the dominant textile, went crazy about this New World dye. Next, we move on to silk. Here we have 2 silk pillowcases that started out white. This one was mordanted with Stannous Chloride, this one with alum. To get more silk, I went to the thrift store where you can buy 100% silk ties for $2.99. and I bought a few examples. Now, ties are tricky because they don't start out white. You're dealing with an underlying color. But here are 3 ties dyed with cultivated cochineal. This one was mordanted with alum and it started out gray. This was also gray and but it was mordanted with Stannous Chloride. And this one was a gold color, mordanted with Stannous Chloride. This, by the way, is from the Donald J. Trump signature collection. It was originally gold and now it's Republican red. Ties reveal the limitations of wild cochineal, which isn't as concentrated. I got a bunch of silk ties and dyed them with wild cochineal. They were mordanted with different substances and they started out different colors, but pretty much they all ended up pink, except this one, which originally was a gold color. The biggest difference, however, wasn't with silk or wool. Silk and wool like cochineal. They like dye. They're protein fibers that drink it up. Cotton, not so easy. Here we have 3 little canvas bags, 100% cotton. These 2 were dyed with cultivated cochineal, this one with wild cochineal. This was mordanted with alum, this with Stannous Chloride, and this very, very pale pink was also mordanted with Stannous Chloride. You get similar results testing wild cochineal on these cotton towels. Stannous Chloride, alum, very pale pink, Mamie Eisenhower pink, baby pink. Similar results with cotton yarn. Stannous Chloride with cultivated cochineal, Stannous Chloride with wild cochineal, alum with wild cochineal. The main thing I learned from my cochineal experiments was something I theoretically already knew, but I now know in my gut, which is that cotton is incredibly hard to dye, and it's especially hard to dye red. And this explains a bunch of things in textile history. It explains why Europeans and before them Southeast Asians were so incredibly excited to get Indian cotton prints, because Indians had figured out how to get deep, rich reds on this light, comfortable cotton. It explains why West Africans, who wove fabric out of cotton in much more muted tones, were happy to trade slaves to get those Indian textiles, and also to get silk and wool from Europe in bright, vivid colors. They would take the wool and silk cloth and unravel it to get the thread to use in their own cotton textiles. And it explains why people in Guatemala, the world capital of cochineal production after the revolution in the early 19th century, did not use red in their traditional weaving. They didn't have the mordants for it. Red only became an important part of indigenous attire after the introduction of synthetic dyes in the late 19th century. What I learned from my cochineal experiments is what dyers have been learning for centuries. Especially when you're dealing with biological dyestuffs, there's a lot of trial and error. There are a lot of factors that can make a difference. And no matter what you do, you can never be entirely sure that you're going to get the perfect red. For more textile stories, be sure to check out my other videos. And don't forget to read The Fabric of Civilization: How Textiles Made the World.